Aurelio, muchas gracias. Me recuerda lo de la industria petrolera, que cuando se planteó el debate de centralizar los fondos de la industria petrolera en el Banco Central, ustedes recuerdan, ustedes eran mis clientes y Tony Casa, mi amigo, me pidieron hacer un análisis de la eficiencia de petróleo de Venezuela y lo comparé con las multinacionales, la Exxon, la Shell y Petróleo de Venezuela tenía en términos absolutos mayor productividad de barriles de petróleo por empleado que las multinacionales. Y eso fue publicado en el Diario de Caracas. Bueno, ahora le doy la palabra al Russ Dallen, editor del Daily Journal, que lo ha convertido en el Latin American Journal, y director de Latin Best. Russ, todo tuyo. 12 minutos.
Muy poco. For many of us in the United States and English-speaking areas of the world, Latin America has been a mystery. I came to know it well both as a graduate student at Columbia, where I first read Carlos Rangel's book, but I came to know Venezuela particularly well as the editor of the Daily Journal, which was founded in 1945 in Caracas and went on to also be the publishers of the Diario de Caracas, which was a very important newspaper during the 90s, and Tal Qual in a joint venture with Teodor Petkov, who was featured in the film. I think that language, in addition to religion and colonial history, has stopped a lot of the meaningful relationships with the United States and the rest of the English-speaking world. So I'm going to address in English because I'm going to have a particularly humorous story to tell you, because I read this book in English first several decades ago, and the English title doesn't look anything like the Spanish title. The English title was The Latin Americans, their love-hate relationship with the United States. So it wasn't until about a decade and a half later that I realized it was the same book. When I was sitting at my desk in Caracas, and Columbus Day came around in 2002, and Chavez, who was then the president of Venezuela, decided to rename Columbus Day as the Day of Indigenous Resistance. Exactly the philosophy that Carlos Rangel had preached against in his book about honoring the noble savage. So I thought, wow, if ever there needed to be an update and a final chapter beyond the example of Cuba that Carlos gives in his final chapters, it would be the study of Venezuela. So that's why I guess that Beatriz asked me and Carlos asked me to be here. Not only did Chavez decide in 2002 to change the name of Columbus Day to the Day of Indigenous Resistance, and they went around to destroy a beautiful Columbus statue in the plaza downtown of Caracas. In 2004, Argentina, not to be outdone, the Kirchners also renamed Columbus Day, and then it caught on across Latin America, at least in that side. In 2011, Bolivia followed suit, and President Evo Morales declared that October 12th was a day of decolonization and a day of liberty. When he was inaugurating it, I thought I'd share some of his words to you. He said that the first indigenous head, this is of course Evo Morales is the first indigenous head of state in Latin America. When our Abya Yala, our continent, was invaded by the Spanish, they brought with them egocentrism, individualism, sectarianism, and regionalism by inventing borders that did not exist in our continent. He went on to say that this has been done by the Spanish in order to fuel hate and confrontations between peoples and facilitate politics of theft and permanent looting of our resources. Not to be outdone, Ecuador followed suit later that same year and called it the Day of Multiculturalism and Plurinationalism. Clearly, Rafael had been educated in the United States, but he went to the wrong university, as we would later find out. Instead of the University of Chicago, where they would teach him proper economics, he went to the University of Illinois. So the ideas that Carlos warned about throughout his book are still evident across Latin America, and not just in Cuba, where everything is still blamed on the United States and imperialism, despite the fact that the rest of the world trades with them. It's only the United States who pretty much doesn't trade with them, and they're still all poor. But not to be outdone, we have a perfect example in Venezuela, beyond what just the day of indigenous resistance and embracing that idea of the noble savage. By the way, then there's another problem with the translation in terms of most Americans would see it as the good savage, and it doesn't occur to them that it means the noble savage. So that's another problem with the translation between the cultures. But the ideas that Carlos described in his book are most appropriate to Venezuela, because we have a perfect example of how you can take a country with the world's largest oil reserves, the largest oil reserves in the world, phenomenally rich, more than Saudi Arabia, and how you can now bring it to the brink of bankruptcy by ignoring the very things that Carlos was preaching about and philosophizing about, and bring a country to the brink of bankruptcy, so that now Venezuela's minimum wage, for example, their major wage that most of the population lives on, is basically not even half of what Cuba's is. And that's in a decade and a half. How do you bring a country to that state? One of the great quotes, I had several great quotes that I really liked from Rangel's book that have stuck with me for several decades. And one of them was, "I doubt whether the rest of the world would notice if Latin America slid into the sea." It was not a self-deprecating thing. It was part of a philosophy that, and he goes on to say, and I quote, "We Latin Americans are not happy with ourselves. One all-encompassing fact stands out. The history of Latin America and the present day is a story of failure. It is a truth that hurts, and we seldom mention it." I'll focus just in my last few minutes on the perfect example of where a continent of 600 million has ultimately failed, because we haven't actually, we're able to compare it with the rest of the world. And Carlos has been proven right by both history before he wrote and history after, and that we don't learn. Of the 32 Latin American Caribbean countries, last year they filed 836 patents. The United States filed 159,000 patents. Japan was number 2 with 56,000 patents. South Korea, 18,000 patents. Germany, behind South Korea, with 17,000 patents. China, 8,700. The 32 nations of Latin America and the Caribbean, with 600 million people, including the 7th and 15th largest populations in the whole world, filed 836 patents for the total continent. And just to make bear out something that also Carlos had pointed out, that he didn't, when he considered the 18 nations of Latin America, he didn't consider Brazil one of them because of their Portuguese ancestry. And Brazil filed the most patents, actually, of Latin America, with 362. Mexico, 222. Argentina came in third, 81. Chile, 64. Colombia with 25. Costa Rica, I'm sorry, Colombia was 35. Costa Rica with 32. Cuba, 19. Venezuela, below Cuba, at 14. Trinidad and Tobago, 8. Peru, 5. Ecuador, 3. And Bolivia, 1. The numbers speak for themselves.